Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive into the followers of Diablo 3. We're getting pretty close to the launch of Diablo 4 and I kind of wanted to make some timeless content that may help people out in the future who continue to play Diablo 3 for future seasons. I'm going to kind of try to cover everything from the basic stuff, sort of leading into the intermediate and onto the advanced elements of the follower, and so hopefully you find something useful out of this guide. I'm going to kind of start with the basic stuff, and so a lot of this may seem pretty elementary to you, but if you stick it out, I'm sure you might be able to learn something by the end. So the first thing I'd like to go over are the skills that scale based on how much main stat your follower has. Starting here with anatomy, for example, increasing the crit hit chance by 4% based on the amount of dexterity that my scoundrel has. So these assorted skills down here that are scaling based off of the main stat of your follower, they actually cap out at 25,000, and so you don't have much incentive to go beyond 25,000 main stat on your follower. In fact, I'd go as far as to say you basically have absolutely no incentive whatsoever. Although it will continue to technically increase their damage, the amount of damage that your follower does in this game is so negligible that it wouldn't even matter if I 20x'd the amount of dexterity on my scoundrel, he still wouldn't do any meaningful damage. Despite there being this hard cap of 25,000 on your main stat, there are some other stats that actually work out pretty well on followers. For example, my scoundrel has 18.8k intelligence, and I've gotten all this just by augmenting every piece of gear with intelligence. Now the reason that I've chosen to do this is because it's going to add a lot of toughness for him, and I'm still at the point in the season where I would much rather be using this token to gain access to all skills as opposed to the one that's going to ensure that my follower cannot die. By using intelligence on the scoundrel, we're actually adding more to resist all elements on top of his stat sheet. For every 10 points of intelligence that the scoundrel has, he's getting 0.1 to resist all elements. This is really useful for keeping the scoundrel alive and unlocking all of his skills at the same time. You're not going to really be able to pull this off when you're pushing really high GR tiers. For example, you're not going to be able to walk into a 150 and just keep your scoundrel alive with this token. You can do speed GR 120s, 125s, even 130s if you're clearing the content fast enough. The general rule of thumb is that as long as you're clearing the GR tier that you're on in under 3 minutes, you're not leaving enough time for the enemies to kill your scoundrel while he's this geared out. And the same could be said for the Enchantress and the Templar as well. As long as you've got their stats high enough and you've got a good amount of toughness, they will not be dying if you're clearing rifts in 3 minutes or less. Now, although we're showcasing the scoundrel right now, if you were to gear out a Templar, for example, and you wanted them to be just as tough as the scoundrel, you would only really want to switch the strength for the dexterity. Your stat sheet would otherwise want to look somewhat similar to this. If you wanted to roll with an Enchantress, what you would want to do is instead get 25,000 intelligence and then get as much strength as you can with your augments. Some other stats that are generally really good to roll include resist all elements, additional armor rolls, life per hit, and attack speed. And when it comes to the Templar, it's not bad to get additional block chance where you can, as well as cooldown reduction. Unfortunately, the Templar is the only follower in the game that actually benefits from having more cooldown, and on top of that, they only benefit for one ability, which is their heal. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't spend too much time working on perfectly optimizing their gear as long as they are strong enough to get through your speed GRs and they're not dying. Two other ways that you can really quickly add a lot of toughness to your followers is by adding an esoteric alteration and a mutilation guard to the sockets on their jewelry. These are the only two legendary gems in the game that actually work on the follower. Unfortunately, you can't use something like Molten Wildebeest Gizzard or any other defensive gems to help out. When it comes to the gear on your follower, there's a million different ways you can set them up. The only thing that really stays consistent from season to season are the key emanating items. This would include the Flavor of Time, the Nemesis Bracers, and the Oculus Ring. Now in Season 28, Gloves of Worship is on this list of key emanating items. However, outside of Season 28, when we are not getting random shrine effects from our potions, this is not nearly as important. Aside from those three items, there's really a lot of different choices that you have in each slot. For example, if we look at the helm, we could go with a Broken Crown, we could take a Blinding Faith for additional chance on hit to blind for our follower, we could go with a Leoric's Crown to double the effect of whatever gem we're putting into there. Those are really the only three options I can think of off the top of mind, but generally speaking, what you want to be looking out for is not necessarily just gear that emanates, but gear that might have a really strong secondary ability, like the Blinding Faith. I don't happen to have one of these on hand on my character, but I did look it up just so that you could see this. This would actually be located down in the secondary stats location of the helm, and I feel like that's a place that we often don't look, but we have a 20 to 40% chance to blind on hit. When we combo that with the attack speed and the natural attack rate of our followers, we can get off a lot of blinds, which can really help CC enemies for us. So when it comes to items that don't have specific legendary powers on their secondary, you may want to look out to see if they have some kind of basic secondary and they just have a really high roll. In fact, most legendary items that don't have any kind of special effect typically have a really high secondary roll of sorts. A great example of this is the item of Tyrael's Might, which on the secondary has plus 14% damage to demons that can actually roll all the way up to 20%. So before writing off some of these items as just trash legendaries, go ahead and take a look and just make sure to familiarize yourself with the secondary rolls on each of these, because some of them are actually halfway decent on the follower. Now next up, I kind of wanted to cover what point in the season you want to be using each different follower token and what they're good for. So on the top row, we have the Skeleton Key, the Enchanting Favor, and the Smoking Thurible, the ones that ensure that your follower cannot die. I've actually got these lined up from top to bottom for when you'll want to use them at each point in the season. And so at the very start of the season, you would want to use this row. You would want to ensure that your follower cannot die. Really early on, they're not going to have nearly enough toughness to survive in GRs, probably not even enough toughness to survive in a basic rift. And for that reason, I would recommend that you continue to use these ones until you've got at least fully augmented gear on your follower. And as a reminder of those augments, once again, that's going to be Strength for the Enchantress to add the most toughness. It's going to be Intelligence for both the Templar and the Scoundrel to add the most toughness. Once you've got all the augments complete and you've got pretty decent defensive rolls on your follower, then you can move down to this next tier to unlock access to all skills. These are what you're actually going to use for the vast majority of the season once you've gotten a decent set of gear together for your follower. If you're spending most of your season farming out Paragon levels and getting your character as strong as possible, gearing up towards a big push at the end, you're going to be using this for the majority of the time. Getting our own characters geared out in Diablo 3 does not take a long time at all, and the same can be said for our followers. It's really not going to take us that long to quickly set some items aside from Kadala that happen to roll ancient and happen to work well on followers. So it really shouldn't take you too long to transition from here to here. It is going to take you a while before you transition down to the next tier. And this is kind of a trick, because once we get to our third row here, we're actually just going back to the first row by ensuring that our follower cannot die. Once you've gotten to a point where you are pushing for higher and higher tiers and you're no longer able to clear out these GRs in under 3 minutes, now your follower is at risk for dying. Having downtime on your follower is not worth it. Even if your follower is only dying once per rift, or maybe even once every other rift, it's still probably not worth it, especially when you're grabbing pylons without a flavor of time, and you're not spawning an elite when you grab them as well. So even 20 seconds of downtime can make a huge difference. So for that reason, when your follower starts to die every once in a while, you're going to want to transition back to ensuring that they cannot die. Now down here at the bottom, I did add this one just to quickly talk about it, but this one is never really the best in slot option. There's a couple different problems with this one, and the first big problem is that it doesn't address how many passive skills our followers have. By gaining access to all skills, we're benefiting from all of the passives and all of the cooldowns. When we're using this token, we're only really gaining any kind of additional benefit from the rows that only have cooldowns. And the second problem with this is that it kind of forces us to build our follower in a specific way. Let's take the Enchantress for example. If we add the token to reduce the cooldown of all follower skills by 50%, on the first tier, we could benefit from either one. If we move down to the second tier, we're not having any benefit whatsoever from having this token because they're both passives. And when we move down into this third tier, and we have an option between Powered Shield, which is a passive, and Erosion, which is a cooldown, we're effectively forced to go with the option for Erosion. So it's for these reasons that I really dislike these as a legendary focus option. Now before we wrap this video up, there's just three things that I wanted to quickly cover just for your general knowledge. The first one is that your follower actually has a 75-yard leash, meaning that if you get up to 75 yards away from your follower, they're going to automatically teleport to you. Keep this in mind if you're taking an ability like Focused Mind to rely on hitting an attack speed breakpoint. Since this has a 40-yard radius around the Enchantress, there are going to be times where you're going to be missing that breakpoint. So be cautious, especially when you're pushing and you need to be reliant on hitting these certain breakpoints to maximize your DPS, that you're staying within a reasonable proximity of your follower if you're relying on a skill like this. The next thing that I wanted to note is that once you have learned a follower skill, you can change it, but you can never unlearn it. And so bear this in mind when you're thinking about pushing towards the end of the season. If you're going to use the Scoundrel, there are a lot of pushing builds that actually don't want to take advantage of either one of these skills. Take, for example, a build that's reliant on COE, and so you're packing together a bunch of enemies for one massive burst. While you're grouping them up, you don't want the Scoundrel necessarily shooting and slowing down enemies. You want them to be following and leashing to you, and the more he shoots these off, the harder that's actually going to be. And so think about it and where you want to go at the end of the season, and if any ability will get in your way. For this reason, it's not a bad idea to use one type of follower for speed content and then another one for pushing content. This way, if you're relying on packing up enemies, you're not taking any skills that are going to make that a little bit more difficult on you. And the last thing that I'd like to take note of is that you actually benefit from 20% of your followers' gold find bonus as well as 20% of their percent experience bonus. So for example, if we were to put this Imperial Ruby into my follower's helm and he gets plus 3.5% additional experience gained, we're going to benefit from 20% of that. It's a pretty small amount, but at the end of the day, it can help out a little bit. Well guys, that's just about all that I have to cover with the follower in Diablo 3. If you have any knowledge on followers that you'd like to share with everybody else, go ahead and drop a comment down below. As always guys, I really appreciate you for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.